Welcome to this explainer. Look, if you really want to understand the engine driving today's populist and conservative movements, you gotta look way past the daily headlines. Today, we're decoding the Promethean Action broadcast. Let's dive right in and see exactly how they connect history, economics, and modern strategy.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, the end of globalization. Then, we'll look at the clash between the American and British systems, followed by the Board of Peace, rethinking global hotspots, and finally, their midterm election strategy. Let's get to it.
All right, part one, the end of globalization, a paradigm shift.
The central premise of this whole broadcast hinges on one absolutely massive claim. They believe the post-World War II global system is literally dead. And the ultimate signal for this? Donald Trump's speech at Davos. He flat out called globalization a failed model that caused mass migration and shipped out heavy industry. To the Promethean Action team, this wasn't just typical political rhetoric, it was the official declaration of a totally new economic era.
Now, to really get where they're coming from, we have to look at how they actually define globalization. They don't just see it as international free trade, not at all. They view it as a deliberate, active effort by global oligarchs to totally erase national sovereignty, blend cultures together, and build a one-world government. In this framework, things like language and borders aren't just lines on a map. They are absolutely crucial protectors of a nation's unique identity.
Moving on to part two. American versus British systems, the philosophical clash.
So, the hosts make this fascinating argument that modern history isn't actually about capitalism versus communism. Instead, it's a fundamental clash between two completely different systems. On one side, you have the American system. This is all about human creativity, physical manufacturing, tariffs, and national banking. But on the flip side is the British system, which they argue relies heavily on financial parasitism, looting national wealth, and dragging us into perpetual wars just to maintain control.
At its very core, this divide is deeply philosophical. We're not just talking about money here, we're talking about human nature itself. The big question is, are humans inherently creative beings born with inalienable rights? Or, as they claim the British system views it, are we basically just subjects or even beasts that need strict control from the top down?
So, how exactly does this specific political faction connect these centuries-old philosophical theories to the gritty reality of modern geopolitics? Well, this is where their take on recent foreign policy gets really interesting. That brings us to part three, the Board of Peace, the global chessboard.
The hosts look at the newly established Board of Peace as a massive game-changer. They see it as a mechanism that's actively stripping away traditional European influence from the Middle East, bringing in Arab and Muslim states as true, equal partners. And here's a wild twist. Former British Prime Minister Tony Blair is actually involved in this. But rather than seeing that as a compromise, the hosts theorize it's a classic keep your enemies close tactic to keep an eye on globalist maneuvers. They point to real, tangible outcomes, like a Palestinian representative announcing the opening of the Rafah crossing as rock-solid proof of this new approach.
All right, part four, rethinking global hotspots, geopolitical strategy. When looking at global conflicts, this broadcast completely bypasses your standard everyday partisan narratives. It's like a totally different lens. Take Greenland, for example. They see the New Deal there as essentially nullifying a monarchy's strategic veto. Down in Venezuela, bypassing the traditional opposition is seen as a highly calculated strike against Wall Street drug money laundering. And over in Iran and Syria, refusing to launch kinetic military attacks isn't viewed as weakness at all. Instead, it's seen as a deliberate strategy to sidestep neoconservative traps.
They strongly emphasize that the administration is intentionally avoiding those chaotic standard regime change operations that intelligence agencies have historically used to keep the world unstable. Why? Because knocking out a leader and creating a power vacuum usually just invites a much worse alternative to step right in. They actually point to the rise of ISIS as the prime historical example of this exact failure.
Okay, so shifting from the global stage back to the home front, we have to ask, how do they take this massive, high-level worldview and translate it into actual, boots-on-the-ground advice for voters? What does all this mean for you?
Which leads us into part five, the midterm election strategy, the domestic battlefront.
The hosts are completely rejecting standard grievance politics here. Instead, they are practically begging voters to drop their spectator status. They explicitly warn their listeners, stop waiting around for crazy internet rumors to come true, or holding your breath for mass arrests or the Insurrection Act. They see all of that as psychological operations meant to make you passive. They want a total rejection of this compensate the loser mentality.
Instead of sitting back,
their proposed solution is super aggressive and highly structured. Step 1. Get off social media and study executive orders directly from the White House website. Step 2. Campaign strictly on measurable economic wins. Step 3. Put the pressure on local politicians and force them to publicly adopt these policies. And the final step? Swamp the vote. The idea is to mobilize in such mind-boggling numbers that any alleged election fraud is just entirely crushed by the sheer volume of turnout.
And they back this whole strategy up with hard data. For instance, they highlight that over 400 new manufacturing facilities broke ground in just a single month. For the host, this is the silver bullet. You don't need to argue abstract ideology at the doorstep. You just show people this undeniable, measurable economic growth that actually impacts working-class lives. Ultimately, they argue that securing the election comes down to intense, personal mobilization. Relying on the traditional party machine, just not going to cut it. It requires individuals actively dragging their friends, family, and coworkers to the polls to make the results absolutely too big to rig.
So, we've seen how Promethean action connects this deep, philosophical rejection of globalization directly to a very actionable grassroots strategy. Which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought to take away from this explainer today. If this broadcast is accurately mapping out the administration's overarching playbook, what piece of the old global chessboard is going to be targeted next? Keep asking the big questions.